spent 30 years holding my father's business and marriage together. At his funeral, a woman I'd never met stood up with a 20-year-old son and a claim at my father's funeral during the part where the priest invited anyone who wished to speak. A woman I had never seen before stood up in the third pew, well-dressed, composed, grieving in a way that was clearly real. And she said to a church full of my family and my father's business associates and the whole of the town that knew us, "My name is Coletta Mara. I loved Gerald for 22 years, and this is our son, Julian." She put her hand on the shoulder of a young man beside her, a young man of about 20 who had, I saw it the instant she said it, everyone saw it, my father's exact jaw, my father's exact way of standing. "I'm sorry to do this here, but Gerald's family should know he had another one, and that he took care of us, and that we have a right to grieve him too. And Julian has a right to what his father would have wanted him to have." And my mother made a sound I have never heard a human being make before, and I caught her as she went down and over the top of her head as I held my collapsing mother in a church. I looked at the young man with my father's jaw. And I understood that the 30 years I had spent holding this family together had been spent holding together a lie whose full size I had never once suspected. Let me back up. My name is Adiz Obi. I'm 52 years old. And I spent 30 years as the person who held my father's business and my parents' marriage together. The fixer, the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed the checks and soothed the tempers and papered over the cracks that appeared again and again. Reasons I never fully understood until the reasons walked into church and gave their names. And when my father died, a second family surfaced, a woman he'd loved for 22 years and a son he'd fathered and funded secretly for 20 of them. Out of the very business I'd broken myself to protect, and I discovered that the endless small crises I'd spent my life fixing had all been the overflow of one enormous crisis I'd never been allowed to see. And then, having survived that, I had to survive what came after, which in some ways was worse. Because my own family, exhausted, humiliated, wanting only for it to stop, decided that the path of least pain was to pay the second family whatever they asked and to be quietly furious with me. The one who insisted on knowing the truth for dragging it all up and not letting your father rest. It took me a year, a bookkeeper's guilty conscience, a hidden record my father kept precisely because he knew what he'd done. A conversation with my mother that turned out to be the opposite of the conversation. I thought we were having to save the business to defeat the lie, without punching the innocent, and to find out that the person I'd spent 30 years protecting had, in his own strange, broken way, been trying to protect us too. You have to understand my father to understand my whole life, because my whole life was, in a sense, a response to him. Gerald Obi was the most charming man I have ever known, and I have known some charming men, and none of them were in his league. He came from nothing, built a construction and property business from a single van into a company that employed 60 people and built half the newer streets in our town, and he did it on charm and nerve and an absolute refusal to be told no. People loved him. Clients loved him, suppliers loved him, the bank loved him, the town loved him. My father could walk into a room where everyone was furious with him and walk out an hour later with everyone laughing and a new contract signed. And charm like that is a shadow, and the shadow was recklessness. My father was reckless with money, reckless with promises, reckless with the truth when the truth was inconvenient. He overcommitted constantly. He'd promise 3 clients the same completion date. He'd sign a deal the business couldn't fund, and then conjure the funding from somewhere at the last second. He lived permanently one crisis away from disaster and permanently confident that his charm would clear it, and infuriatingly, for decades it did. And I was the one who cleaned up behind the charm. I don't fully know how it happened, except that it happened early. I was clever and careful and steady, the temperamental opposite of my father, and by the time I was in my early 20s, I had become, informally and then formally, the person in the business who made my father's chaos survival. I did the actual management. I did the books, or oversaw them. I managed the client relationships my father had overpromised and smoothed the ones he defended. I found the money when he'd committed money that didn't exist. I was the operations director, eventually, in title, but the truth is I was the fixer. The person whose entire job was to stand behind Gerald Obi and quietly make reality catch up with his promises. Let me give you one job, one representative crisis, because I cleaned up behind the charm is a summary, and the summary is how they later erased 30 years of my life into a footnote. I was 34. My father had, without telling anyone, promised a major client that we completed development by a date that was physically impossible. He'd promised it in a room over lunch on charm to win the contract, and then he'd come back to the office glowing and told me to make it work. The way he always did, as though reality were a mood I could adjust. And it could not be made to work. The date was a fantasy, and if we missed it, there were penalty clauses that would have taken a serious bite out of the company and, worse, out of our reputation, which in that town was the whole game. I fixed it. I spent 6 weeks I will never get back, nights, weekends, my own health, restructuring the entire project, renegotiating with 3 subcontractors, finding efficiencies that didn't exist until I invented them, and personally managing the client, a difficult man. Keeping him warm and confident while I quietly rebuilt the thing my father had promised him out of thin air. And we hit the date. Barely. And the client was delighted, and he took my father to lunch to celebrate, and my father accepted the congratulations for a miracle I had performed, and came back glowing again and said to me, "See, I told you it'd work out. You worry too much, Adiz." Worry too much. And I remember not even being angry because that was the arrangement, that was the deal I'd accepted without ever agreeing to it. He made the impossible promises and took the glory, and I made them possible in the dark and took the exhaustion. And we both called it partnership because calling it what it was would have required one of us to change. That was one crisis. There were hundreds, 30 years of hundreds, and every single one of them I now understand. was also quietly funding a second household I didn't know existed. Every miracle I performed kept afloat the ship that was carrying the secret, and my father would come back from those celebration lunches glowing and go some of those nights not home to us. And I told myself it was partnership. I told myself we were a great team, the visionary and the fixer, the charm and the competence. And we were, in a way. But there's a difference between a partner and a person whose life has been organized around absorbing the consequences of someone else's behavior. And it took me decades and a funeral to understand which one I'd been. Let me tell you about the marriage, because I held that together too, and I never understood why it needed so much holding. My parents' marriage was, from the outside, solid, decades long, respectable, the foundation of the family. But I had grown up inside it, and I knew that it cracked. Periodically, unpredictably, my parents' marriage would go through a bad patch, a coldness, a tension, my mother withdrawn and my father overly, performatively attentive. And then it would pass, and things would be normal again, and no one ever explained it, and I learned not to ask. And I became, in the family way, the manager of that too. When the atmosphere turned, I was the one who kept things running, who kept the family functioning, who took my mother out to lunch when she was low and never asked why. Who covered for my father's absences, the business trips that ran long the weekends he was, at a site, the phone calls he took in another room. I covered for those absences without ever once letting myself think about what I was covering. I was very, very good at not thinking about it. 30 years good. I want to be honest about that because it's the part I've had to sit with. On some level, I must have known. Not the specifics, not a second family, not a son, not 22 years, but something. You don't spend 30 years covering a man's absences and smoothing a marriage's inexplicable cracks without some buried part of you knowing there's a reason. I chose not to know. Knowing would have required action, and action would have blown up the family I'd made it my life's work to hold together. And so I performed a kind of willed innocence for decades. And the price of that innocence was that the truth, when it came all at once. In a church in front of everyone with my mother collapsing in my arms. Let me tell you about the money, because this is where Act 1 quietly plants the bomb. The business always had a strange financial texture that I noticed and never solved. There was always a leak. Persistent, low-level drain that I could never quite locate, money that should have been there and wasn't, margins that should have been healthier, a company that made good money and was always somehow tighter than it should be. I put it down to my father's recklessness, to the overcommitments, to the deals that went bad. I spent years trying to plug a leak whose source I never found, because I was looking in the business, and the leak wasn't in the business. The leak was a second household. For 20 years, a portion of the money I was breaking myself to earn and protect was flowing, quietly, out of the company to Colette and Julian. I was, without knowing it, financially supporting my father's second family with my own labor. Every year I made the business more efficient, I was making more available to be siphoned. Every crisis I fixed kept afloat the vessel that was carrying the secret. My competence didn't just fail to expose the betrayal, it funded it, and it hid it, because a well-run company can absorb a leak that would sink a badly run one. I was the perfect, unwitting accomplice, too skilled to let the business collapse and reveal the drain, too loyal to look in the one direction that would have shown me the truth. 30 years. And then my father had a heart attack on a Tuesday and died in the ambulance, and 4 days later, at his funeral, the leak stood up in the third pew and told the whole town its name. I've told you the moment. Colette Amara, standing, composed, grieving, real. Julian beside her with my father's jaw, my mother going down in my arms. I need you to understand that I did not, in that first instant, doubt it. That's the horror. The moment she said it, 1,000 things I'd spent 30 years not thinking rearranged themselves into a picture so complete and so obvious that my only feeling, underneath the shock, was a terrible click of recognition. Of course, the absences, the leak, the cracks in the marriage. The weekends at sites. Of course, she wasn't lying. I knew she wasn't lying before I knew anything else about her, because she was the answer to a question I'd been refusing to ask for 3 decades. And in the days after the funeral, the shape of the crisis assembled itself, and it was worse than the fact of her, because the fact of her came with a claim. Colette was not, it turned out, a fantasist or an opportunist in the simple sense. She and my father had genuinely been together for 22 years. Julian was genuinely my father's son. A DNA test later would put it beyond doubt, and honestly his face put it beyond doubt before any test. My father had genuinely supported them, housed them, funded Julian's entire life for 20 years out of the business. Colette had a real relationship, a real son, and a real, documented, 2-decade financial entanglement with my father and therefore with the company, which meant she had a real claim. Julian was my father's child, with the same rights as any child under the law. And the money that had flowed to them for 20 years, some of it could be characterized as gifts. But some of it was tangled up in the business in ways that gave Colette arguments, real ones, about promises made about a stake, about provision my father had led them to expect. She arrived within 2 weeks with a solicitor and a claim that reached directly into the business. My business, the business I'd built and run and saved 100 times, and threatened to take a piece of it large enough to sink it. And here is where my own family became the second betrayal, which was in some ways harder than the first. Because my father's brothers and the wider family, and even this is the part that broke something in me, even at first my mother, wanted to make it go away. And make it go away meant pay Colette whatever she asked, quickly, quietly, before it got into the courts and the papers and the town's mouth any more than it already had, and then never speak of it again. Their logic was grief and shame, and I understood it, and it enraged me. My uncle said, "Gerald's gone, dragging this through the courts won't bring him back. It'll just destroy his name and cost a fortune in legal fees and drag the family through the mud for a year. Just settle, pay her, Make it stop. And underneath that unspoken and unmistakable was the thing that would define the next year of my life. A low, growing resentment of me because I was the one saying wait. Because I was the one saying we need to know exactly what he did. And exactly what she's actually owed before we hand over a business 60 people's jobs depend on, because I was the one refusing to let it be smoothed over. Let me show you exactly how that pressure was applied, because it wasn't a single confrontation, it was a siege. And it came dressed as love and grief, which is the only disguise that works on someone like me. Uncle Emeka came to my house, my father's eldest brother, the family patriarch now, and he sat in my kitchen and he was kind, and he was grieving, and he said, "Adiz, you've always been the sensible one, the one who sorts things out. So sort this out the sensible way. Pay the woman. It's only money and the business makes money, and what's a payment against your father's name being dragged through every court report in the county? Think of your mother. Every day this goes on is a day she has to live with it in the papers. You can end it tomorrow with a check. The sensible thing, the kind thing, is to make it stop." And he took my hand, the way my father used to, and he said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, love." Do you see what he did? He took the exact quality that had defined my whole life. I sort things out, I make things stop, I protect my mother, and he pointed it at the wrong target. For 30 years, sort it out had meant fix the problem. Now sort it out meant bury the problem, and he was counting on me not to notice the substitution, because I'd spent my life answering to that phrase like a dog to a whistle. And it worked on the whole family at once. Within a fortnight, there was a soft, unanimous, grieving consensus that the decent thing, the loving thing, the thing Gerald would have wanted, was to pay Colette quickly and quietly and let everyone heal. And I was the one lone voice saying, wait. We don't yet know what he actually did. We don't know what she's actually owed. We can't hand over a business 60 families depend on to make our own shame go away faster. And that voice, in that atmosphere of grief and shame, did not sound sensible. It sounded cold. It sounded like a woman who cared more about money than about her dead father's dignity or her mother's peace. My uncle started to look at me the way you look at someone who's embarrassing themselves. Adiz won't let it go. Adiz making it about the business. Adiz always has to be in control. The exact competence they relied on for 30 years became, overnight, a character flaw, the moment I aimed it at the truth instead of at their comfort. I had spent 30 years as the family's smoother, and now, at the one moment smoothing would have been a catastrophe, I refused to smooth, and the family did not know what to do with me. The fixer wouldn't fix. And so I became, in their eyes, the problem. Adiz won't let it go. Adiz is making it worse. Why does Adiz have to drag it all up? Can't she just let her father rest? The woman who'd protected them all for 3 decades became, the moment she insisted on the truth, the one accused of disturbing the peace. The peace being, in this case, a comfortable lie purchase with the business and 60 jobs. I got a solicitor of my own, a woman called Enkechayez, sharp and calm, and I went to her expecting her to tell me Colette's claim was opportunistic and weak, that a mistress and a secret son couldn't just walk in and take a family business. And Enkech told me something much more frightening, that the claim was, in significant part, real. She said, "Adiz, I have to be straight with you. Julian is your father's biological son. Legally, that is simply a fact, and it gives him standing. As a child of the deceased, he has potential claims on the estate, and depending on what your father promised and documented, potentially on assets connected to the business. And Colette, 22 years, a documented 2-decade financial relationship, a child raised on the expectation of provision, she's not a stranger with her hand out. She has arguments. Some of them are good." She paused. Here's the exposure. Her father ran money to them through the business for 20 years. That means the business's own records will show it. Which cuts both ways. It proves the entanglement she's claiming. But it also means that if this goes to open court, the entire 20-year history of your father funding a secret family out of a 60-employee company becomes a matter of public record. Clients will see it. A bank will see it. Your competitors will see it. The reputational damage alone could destroy the company independently of any money that's awarded. She looked at me steadily. Your family's instinct to settle quickly and quietly is not stupid. It's actually, in narrow terms, quite rational. Fast, confidential settlement might genuinely be the cheapest way to save the business, even if it means paying Colette far more than a court would ever give her, and even though it means rewarding the concealment. That was the false victory in its cruelest form. The neutral expert, my own solicitor, confirming that the right thing, expose the truth, pay only what was genuinely owed, refused to be extorted by the threat of scandal, was also the dangerous thing. And that my family's shameful instinct to pay and bury might actually be the pragmatic one. The truth had a price tag, and the price tag was the business and 60 jobs, and I was the only one insisting we pay it. And Colette's solicitor, sensing the family's desperation to keep it quiet, pitched the claim high, far higher than the genuine entitlement. I was sure of it, but backed by the unbearable leverage of scandal. Pay this large sum, confidentially, now, or we go to open court, and every client and every bank and every gossip in the town learns exactly how Gerald Obie funded his second family, and your company dies of shame before any judge rules on anything. I sat with that, and with my whole family telling me to pay it, and my mother pale, destroyed, aged 10 years and 2 weeks, saying quietly, "Just make it stop, Adiz, please. I can't bear it. Pay her and make it stop." And I very nearly did. I had spent my life doing what would make things stop for this family. Every instinct I had, 30 years deep, was screaming to smooth it, pay it, bury it, protect my mother from one more day of it. I had the settlement terms in front of me. I was going to authorize it, and 2 things stopped me. The first was a woman named Grace Adami, who had kept the books of my father's company for 26 years. Grace was semi-retired now, in her 70s, and she had been the quiet constant of that business's finances for my entire adult life. And I had always assumed Grace knew everything about the money, and I had never once thought about what everything might include. And Grace rang me, about 3 weeks in, and asked to see me privately, not at the office, and when I sat down in her front room, she was already crying. She said, "Adiz, I have to tell you something and I have to ask you to forgive me, and you might not, and that's fair." She wiped her eyes. I knew about the payments. Not the whole of it, not who she was for years, but I knew there was money going out regular for 20 years to a person and an arrangement your father told me never to ask about. He was my employer. He was Gerald. You didn't say no to Gerald. He told me it was private and personal and that it would hurt people if it came out, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I processed those payments for 20 years, and I never told you. And I have felt sick about it every single day, especially the days I watched you tearing yourself apart trying to find a leak that I knew where it was. She was properly crying now. You'd come to me some quarters and say, "Grace, I can't find where this money's going. Help me trace it." And I'd help you trace everything except the one thing, and I'd watch you blame yourself and blame the business, and I said nothing. I'm so sorry. I was a coward and I was loyal to the wrong person. And then Grace said the thing that changed the entire war. She said, "But Adiz, I kept records of all of it, every payment." Because even while I was staying silent, some part of me knew that one day the truth would matter, and that when it did, the difference between what your father actually gave them and what somebody might claim he gave them would be the whole ballgame. I have 20 years of exactly what went where, and I'll tell you now what I should have told you years ago. The payments were real, but they were not what that woman's solicitor is going to say they were. Your father supported them. He did not promise them the company. I know, I'd have processed it. What she's claiming and what he actually did are two different numbers, and I have the real one. Second thing was the box, and the box is the thing I'll carry for the rest of my life. Because when I finally forced myself to go through my father's private effects, the personal safe deposit box the family knew existed, and that I'd been avoiding because I couldn't bear what else might be in it, I found that Gerald Obie, charming, reckless, secret-keeping Gerald Obie, done the one thing that redeemed him about a millimeter, which was that he had, in the end, tried to control the damage he'd done from beyond the grave in writing. There was a file in that box. Private, meticulous file, in my father's hand, that documented his second life with a care he had never applied to anything in his public life. And it was not a love letter, and it was not a confession exactly. It was, I realized as I read it, a man trying to be fair to everyone at once, and failing at all of it honestly. It recorded the payments, matching Grace's records almost exactly, a complete account of what he had actually given Colette and Julian over 20 years. And there was a letter, to me. Because of course it was to me, I was the fixer, and even in death my father handed me the mess to sort. It said, "Adiz, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found the worst thing about me, and I'm sorry you're the one who has to. I'm sorry it's you. It was always you. You've cleaned up after me your whole life, and here's the last one, the big one, and I couldn't find the courage to spare you it while I was alive. Her name is Colette, and the boy is Julian, and he's your brother, and none of it is his fault. Remember that, whatever happens, the boy did nothing. I loved her. I wouldn't insult your mother by explaining it. I was weak, and I was selfish, and I ran 2 lives because I couldn't give up either, and I told myself I was managing it. The way I told myself I managed everything on charm, and charm doesn't manage anything. It just delays the bill. Here is what I need you to know, because I know what will happen when I'm gone. Colette will have a claim, and it will be partly just, and Julian deserves something from me because he's mine, and I failed to be a proper father to him in the open. Give him that. He's owed it. But Colette will also be advised to ask for far more than I ever gave or promised, and she may threaten the business to get it in Adiz. The business is your mother's security and 60 families' livelihoods and your life's work. And I will not let my weakness take that too. So I wrote it all down. Every payment exactly. What's fair is in this file. Give Julian what's fair and not 1 pound of extortion. And protect your mother and protect the company the way you always have, the way I always let you. I have no right to ask you for anything. I'm asking anyway. Sort it out, my clever girl. One last time. Dad. Give Julian what's fair and not 1 pound of extortion. My father, who had betrayed us all for 22 years, had also at the end left me the exact weapon I needed to defeat the inflated claim while honoring the just one, because even in his ruin, some deep part of him had wanted to protect my mother and the business, and to be fair to the innocent son, and he'd known that the only person who could thread that needle was the daughter he'd spent 30 years handing his messes to. And then there was the third thing, and it is the thing I understand least and treasure most, and it came from my mother, because I went to my mother finally with the file, ready to break the last piece of her, ready to tell her that my father had documented everything, that it was real, all of it. And she looked at the file in my hands, and she did not fall apart. She said quietly, "How much did he leave in that box?" And I said, "Mum, you knew." And my mother, my broken, collapsed, aged 10 years mother, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face, something old and tired and unbearably clear, and she said, "Adiz, I have been married to your father for 41 years. I knew about Colette for nearly 20 of them. She let that sit while my whole understanding of my parents rearranged itself for the second time in a month. I found out when you were a girl. And I made a decision, and it was my decision to make, not yours, and I have never regretted it, and I will never explain all of it to you because some of it is mine. I stayed, for reasons. Some good, some weak, some that are nobody's business but mine and his and God's. And I let you believe the marriage just cracked, sometimes because I was protecting you, the same way you thought you were protecting me. We spent 30 years protecting each other from a thing we both already knew. She took my hand. So don't you dare fall apart on my account, and don't you dare pay that woman a penny more than your father actually owed her. Because I did not stay in this marriage for 41 years and swallow what I swallowed to watch her walk off with the business on top of everything else. I'm not broken at ease. I'm just finally allowed to stop pretending. Now, let's you and me sort this out. The reckoning happened in a mediation, not a courtroom, which was the whole point, because I no longer needed the courtroom, and Colette's leverage had always been her threat to use it. Colette and her solicitor came in confident, holding the scandal over the table like a knife, expecting a frightened, shamed family to pay enormously to keep it quiet. And my uncles were there, still wanting exactly that. And my mother was there, and Colette had clearly been told my mother was destroyed, a non-factor, which was Colette's second mistake, my father's file being the first thing she didn't know about. And Nkechi laid it out. She said, let's be clear about what is and isn't in dispute. Julian is Gerald Obi's son. That is not contested. It is embraced. Julian is entitled to fair provision as Gerald's child, and this family intends to provide it, properly and with respect, because none of this is Julian's fault, and Gerald himself said so in writing. She placed a copy of the relevant part of my father's file on the table. Gerald Obi kept a complete, contemporaneous, private record of every payment he made to Ms. Amara and Julian over 20 years, and a signed statement of his intentions. We have it. It is corroborated to the pound by the company's bookkeeper of 26 years, who is prepared to give evidence. So we know precisely from Gerald's own hand what he actually gave and what he actually intended Julian to have. She let that land, and then she went to the throat of it. Ms. Mara's claim, as pleaded, is for substantially more than Gerald ever gave or documented an intention to give. It is inflated, and it is backed not by entitlement, but by the threat of publicity, the implication that this family will pay a premium to avoid scandal. I want to be very clear about our position on that. She closed the folder. This family is no longer afraid of the scandal. Gerald's widow, and she gestured to my mother, who sat very straight, has known about this relationship for nearly 20 years and is prepared to say so. There's no bomb to hold over us, because the thing you were threatening to reveal is a thing we are now prepared to face in daylight. So the leverage is gone. What remains is the law and Gerald's documented intentions, and by both of those measures, Julian is owed a specific and fair sum, which we will pay, gladly, today, and Ms. Amara is owed nothing beyond what supported her during the relationship, which is now ended. We will honor the son. We will not be extorted over the father. I watched Colette's solicitor recalculate the entire case in about 30 seconds, because a claim built on the fear of scandal collapses completely the moment the other side stops being afraid, and my mother's straight back had just removed the fear from the room. And then I said the one thing I said, and I said it to Julian, not to Colette, to the young man with my father's jaw who had sat silent and mortified through all of it, 20 years old, dragged into a war he didn't start. I said, Julian, none of this is your fault, and I want you to hear that from me, because our father wrote it down and he was right about it. You didn't choose any of this. You're my brother, and I didn't know you existed a month ago, and I'm sorry for what that's been for you too. You are going to get what our father actually wanted you to have, properly, fairly, with respect, because you're his son and that's real and it isn't going anywhere. I looked at Colette, but it's going to be the true number, not the frightened one. My father spent 20 years managing everyone with charm and secrets, and it fell to me to clean up every mess he made, and I'm cleaning up this one too. The same way I did all the others, by finding out what's actually true and refusing to pretend it's anything else. He left me the truth in a box because he knew I was the only one who'd use it fairly. So that's what I'm doing. The truth. No more and no less. It's settled at the true number. Julian received fair, substantial documented provision as my father's son, genuinely fair the number from my father's own file, and I made sure it was generous within the bounds of what was real. Because he was a boy who'd lost a father he'd had to share and hide, and he deserved that. Colette received what the honest accounting showed, and not the extortionate premium the threat of scandal had been meant to extract. Once the scandal lost its power, so did the inflated claim, and her solicitor knew it. The business survived. That was the thing I'd fought the whole family to protect, and it survived, and the 60 jobs survived, because we had faced the truth in a controlled room instead of paying a fortune to keep it buried where it could surface again and again forever. My uncles, who had wanted to pay and blame, were quiet afterward, and one of them apologized, sort of said I'd been right to be stubborn, which from that man was a coronation. The resentment of me curdled back into something like respect, because the fixer had, in the end, fixed the one thing that mattered most, in the one way none of them had the stomach for, by refusing to lie. Julian and I, this is the strange, tender coda I did not expect. Julian and I have a relationship now. Carefully, slowly, he's my brother. It is not his fault. My father was right about that if about nothing else. He came to see me, some months after it all settled, and he said, I spent my whole life being a secret. Do you know what that's like? Being a person who has to not exist. And I did, actually, know something about not letting yourself know a thing, 30 years of it. So we understood each other, in a way, the secret son and the daughter who kept the secret she wouldn't look at. You're not going to be close the way siblings raised together are close, but he calls me sometimes. He's a good young man. My father failed him worse than he failed any of us, because he made his own son into a hidden thing, and Julian carries that, and I'll not add to it. Whatever Gerald was, Julian is innocent, and I decided early I would not let the family's grief and rage land on the one person in the story who chose none of it. The thing I still can't fully hold is my mother. Because my whole life, the story I told myself was that I was protecting her, that I held the family together to shield my fragile mother from my father's chaos. And it turned out she'd known the worst of it for 20 years and had been, in her own silent way, protecting me, letting me believe the marriage merely cracked, so that I could keep my innocence, keep my relationship with my father, keep the version of the family that let me function. We had each spent decades protecting the other from a truth we both, at some level, held. Two women in the same house, each thinking she was the strong one carrying the secret to spare the other, and neither of us ever saying a word. I asked her once, gently, why she'd stayed, and she said, "That's mine, Adiz. Not everything a woman does is for someone else to understand. I made my choices and I don't ask you to approve of them, only to let them be mine." And I let them be hers, because she was right, and because 30 years of managing everyone else's truths had finally taught me that some truths belong only to the person living them, and the respect you owe them is not explanation but silence. She died 3 years later. She died with the business intact, and her dignity intact, and I choose to believe, some relief at finally not pretending, and I held her hand at the end the way I'd held it in the church, and this time she didn't make that terrible sound. She just said, "You sorted it out. I knew you would. You always do." Which is the sentence my father said too in his letter, and I have thought a great deal about being the person of whom both my parents said at the end. Sorted out about whether that's a tribute or a sentence, love or a job, and I've decided it's both, and that both is all right, and that I'd rather be the one who sorts it out than the one who lies. Grace Adamia forgave. Because she asked me to, and because her guilt had kept the records that saved us, and because I understood, God did I understand, what it is to stay silent about a thing to protect a family since I'd done it for 30 years myself. I was facing the other way. She said to me, near the end of it, I kept the books honest even while I kept the secret. I don't know how to explain that except that the numbers felt like the one place I could still tell the truth even while my mouth was lying. And I understood that too. She kept the truth in the letter because she couldn't keep it anywhere else. The letter was what let me be fair to Julian and merciless to the extortion, and so her cowardice and her honesty tangled together for 20 years ended up being the thing that saved the innocent and defeated the lie. Here is the last thing. My father spent his life managing everyone with charm, and charm, as he finally wrote, doesn't manage anything. It just delays the bill. And the bill came all at once in a church, and it landed where every bill in that family had always landed. On me, the fixer, the one who cleaned up behind the charm. But he left me something in that box besides the mess. He left me the truth, the real numbers, the honest account, the fair figure, because in the end, a man who lied to everyone his whole life understood one thing clearly, that the only way to survive what he'd done was for someone to know exactly what was true and to refuse to pretend it was anything else, and that the someone was going to be me. Because it had always been me. My family wanted to pay the lie to make it quiet. My father, of all people, left me the tools to face the truth instead. And my mother, who I thought I was protecting, stood up straight in a mediation and took the fear out of the room so that the truth could win. 3 of them, a dead liar, a guilty bookkeeper, and a woman I'd underestimated my whole life, handed me. Between them, the one thing that beats a scandal and an inflated claim and a family's cowardice all at once. The actual documented, unashamed truth about what happened held by people who each in their broken way had kept it safe for the day it would matter. A woman stood up in the third pew of my father's funeral with his son and a claim, and for a month it looked like she'd take everything he'd built and I'd protected. She didn't. Because my father wrote down the truth in a box, and my mother had been braver for 20 years than any of us knew, and I was, in the end, exactly what they'd both always said I was. The one who sorts it out. I sorted it out. One last time, just like he asked, just like she knew I would. And then, for the first time in 30 years, there was nothing left to hold together, and I put my hands down, and I let it be over, and I found out who I was when I wasn't holding up somebody else's lie. I'm still finding out. It's the best thing I've ever done.